Hi, friends. Welcome back to Indistinct Chatter. I'm Eliza, and this week I am skipping the news once again and getting right into today's episode. But before I get into it, I did want to let you know I will be talking about some pretty heavy stuff. I'm going to discuss some real crimes and deaths, including one case involving suicide. I am also going to share a personal story that involves the exploitation of minors and another that involves domestic violence. I am going to do my best to keep the graphic content to a minimum, but with the content, it's kind of hard to skirt around it completely. So I just wanted to give you a fair warning. If those topics are not for you, please don't listen. Go ahead and skip this week. We can catch up next week. I'll still be here and I'll still love you. With that being said, you ready to get into it? So obviously, I know everyone's algorithm is different-ish, but maybe you've heard this on the news or maybe you saw it shared by a friend. It's a video of this family paddleboarding, and they come up on a situation where a young man or a boy, I'm not entirely sure his age, I think he was a teenager, but anyway, he's with his friends, and I use friends, the term friends lightly here, and I'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, before I discuss the video more, I feel like I should tell you why it's going viral again, because originally the video was posted in June. However, on July 4th, an 18-year-old named Nolan Wells, he went out on a boat with some friends to celebrate the 4th of July. They went to Horn Island, which is this underdeveloped barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So there's nothing there. There's no facilities, no lifeguard, no park staff, no cell service. And really the only way on or off is by taking a boat, like not a public boat. You have to have your own private boat. So like no ferry. There's no roundabout way that anyone could just be casually driving by. Like it's a place that you go to. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, Nolan was a college football player, a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, and his parents described him as a kid with a very big heart. And in his photos from the boat day, you can see he's smiling, he's got his arm around his buddies, and he appears to be the only Black person in the group. All his friends in these photos are white, and I know, but it does matter because of how this story has unfolded, okay? So, Nolan was last seen around 3 p.m. on the 4th. His friends went back to the mainland without him, and according to them, Nolan chose to stay on the island and planned to catch a ride back with another group of friends. Then later on that night, one of his friends contacted the Coast Guard at around 11 p.m. to report him missing, and then his mom reported it to the sheriff's office a bit later around midnight. The next day, a search began, and on Monday, July 6th, a National Park Service agent found Nolan's body in the water off the island's shoreline. This is just so sad and heartbreaking, and I also want to note that this is an ongoing case. It's actively being investigated right now, so we don't 100% know for sure yet what's happening or what happened. But here's what we do know, according to the news. So, the Jackson County Sheriff has said investigators believe Nolan drowned and that they don't suspect foul play. But his family, and honestly, a lot of people online, just simply don't accept that answer, at least not yet. His dad says Nolan could swim, that he could swim well. The family has retained its civil rights attorney, Ben Crump, and they've commissioned an independent autopsy because they have concerns about, how a racially charged investigation might be handled in Mississippi. So, as of recording, the official autopsy has not been released. Toxicology is still pending, and Crump, the family's attorney, has pointed to contradictions in witness statements. There's a question about a girl Nolan was reportedly talking to on the island and whether he said he was staying or leaving. There's also a question about his phone, which his parents apparently found before police did, and the family's attorney says his phone had messages deleted from it. There's also allegedly some kind of argument captured on video that day. However, what that video shows is disputed. It's gotten to the point, really, that investigators have publicly asked anyone who was on Horn Island on July 4th to send in their original unedited photos and videos. So, anyway, you might be wondering, how does this relate to the paddleboarding video? Well, I mentioned that it was originally released in June, right? And then Nolan's death happened in July. And now this paddleboarding video is going viral again. It's resurfaced. Well, the woman who originally uploaded the paddleboarding video stated on her repost that, quote, in light of the Nolan Wells case and being asked to re upload this video multiple times, here it is. And this video has like millions of views. Anyway, other than that, just to be clear, this paddleboarding video has nothing to do with Nolan's case. It's a different state, different people, different situation. It's not evidence of anything. But when you watch it, you might be able to understand why people are connecting the two stories. So basically, in this video, Natalie, her husband, and her kids are all out paddleboarding on a river, I believe in Florida. The weather looks good, water looks all right. I don't know, it's Florida. The water is just always a little bit scary to me. Anyway, in the distance, Natalie and her family can hear yelling, like a bunch of teenagers or something. It's pretty normal, right? Kids having fun, being goofy, being loud, being dumb. But then they hear a voice that says, "Look, I'm gonna die." So Natalie and her family paddle closer and they see Marquise. He's a black teenager. Marquise is standing in the water. He's wearing a life jacket, but the life jacket is very obviously not meant for him. It's a little kid's life jacket. It's way too small for him. And on top of that, he can't swim. And it's his first time at this spot in this river. So, life jacket or not, especially an ill fitted life jacket, if someone can't swim, they shouldn't be alone in the water. Even if you're wearing a life jacket, a current could come, it could pull you under, you could hit your head. Who knows? It's dangerous. And if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have the confidence to understand what to do if you've never learned how to swim, like that's scary. And all the while, you can hear his friends, again, friends, very loose term around friends here. You can hear them mocking him and they're shouting slurs. They're making fun of his dad. They're making monkey noises. Just all around shitty, shitty friends. They've left him alone basically to fend for himself, and they think it's just so funny. Ha ha ha. Meanwhile, Marquise's demeanor is very, to me, seems self preserving. Like he's using words to express that he's scared. He says he thinks he's going to drown or die. So, like, he's clearly uncomfortable and doesn't feel safe, but like his body language is very stoic and calm. Anyway, Natalie and her family, they could have just paddled by at this point. I think a lot of people maybe would have thought that it was just teenagers, being dumb, being dramatic, goofing around, whatever. I'm sure a lot of us have, floated on by a group of teenagers or walked on by a group of teenagers who were probably fine, but they're screaming, they're play fighting, whatever. And we moved on. They could have done the same thing and thought nothing of it. And maybe nothing would have come from it, Maybe it all would have just been okay. Maybe Marquise hopefully just would have found better friends. But Natalie and her family, they didn't think so. So instead, they floated over to him and they extended a paddle. They told Marquise to grab on. He then tells the family that he can't swim and that his friends knew he couldn't swim and still expected him to swim across the river anyway, alone. So Natalie and her family, they stayed really calm. They reassured him he's okay. They got him across the water safely. And Marquise even said in the video, he was like, "I'm never coming back with y'all," to the friends. And boy, oh boy, do I sure hope that that's true. Those are, again, terrible friends. Those are not friends. So in this case, Natalie's family did something that actually has a name in psychology. They're what researchers call an active bystander. She noticed something was off. She decided it was serious. She decided it was her responsibility, and she acted on that. And that sounds so simple in theory, right? Just 4 little steps. Except decades of research says that most of us, most of the time, fail somewhere in those 4 steps and people die because of it. And that's kind of what led us to today's episode. So, once again, before I get into the rest of the episode, I can't remember if I've discussed my complicated relationship with true crime, so I just want to touch on that. On the surface, true crime seems harmless, right? Like, not the actual crime itself, but the craze of true crime. You hear people all the time saying, "Oh, I just love true crime. I'm obsessed with true crime." It is the most popular genre in podcasting. It's basically some people's whole personality. And listen, I get it. I listen to true crime podcasts. I grew up watching shows like Unsolved Mysteries, To Catch a Predator, which the movie coming out about that, it looks like it's going to be chilling. I think I also watched Snapped growing up, definitely watched America's Most Wanted, all those things. And they pique your curiosity. And honestly, I do genuinely believe sometimes that knowing about certain cases can actually help you. Like some cases can literally be life saving for people. I've learned so many ways to protect myself because of true crime stories. It's kind of, how people say hindsight's 2020, only instead of it being your hindsight, you're unfortunately learning from other people's stories. So you kind of learn the red flags to look out for in situations. Um, Maybe you learn what to do or what not to do in other situations. That's basically the same thing. I don't know. That's repeating myself, but whatever. And then of course, there's like a whole psychology level that goes into it too, learning about what makes people snap or people just want to know why people do stuff. So I get the craze, but I do feel like true crime can also feel and be very exploitative. Like when you think about it, you're listening to someone's horrible final moments. It's the worst thing that ever happened to a real family out there. And sometimes a lot of true crime is not that old. And so they have parents or kids or partners or whoever, they have loved ones, friends that are, still mourning the loss of the person that they loved. And here's a podcast that has packaged this part of their story into this neat little box, all for views and downloads. And then in the middle of it, there's an ad for a meal kit or furniture or whatever. And I don't know. And then the victim just kind of gets flattened into just like a blip, a little plot point in their own story, but it's just this one part. And it almost becomes like a character rather than a real person. And I mean, not always. There are some true crime documentaries, podcasters, storytellers who do try their best to honor the victim. They try to make sure that they're getting permission from family and loved ones and whatever. But a lot of times the story just kind of ends up about the criminal or about the crime, not so much the person that lost their life. So yeah, I don't know. I have a complicated relationship with true crime. So it feels a little hypocritical of me because I am going to tell you about some true crimes today, but I'm telling them for a reason. I'm not telling them for shock value, not for downloads, but I wanted to discuss these because I think there's a real lesson in them that could honestly change how maybe you act the next time you see something that doesn't feel right, or hopefully maybe it just serves as kind of a reminder to approach things differently. I feel like it's a good reminder for me. And that doesn't make these tragedies any less tragic. It doesn't bring them back. And obviously, it's sad that people have to die for a lesson to be learned, but that's kind of where we're at. Again, complicated relationship with true crime. So let's start with Memorial Day 2011. We're in Alameda, California, which is an island city right across the bay from Oakland. Memorial Day is that first official holiday signaling summer, so naturally, Robert Crown Memorial Beach is busy. A 53-year-old man named Raymond Zach walks out into the water. He's fully clothed and he just keeps on walking about 150 yards from the shore, and then he just comes to a stop. So he's now standing in neck deep water that's around 60 degrees, which I know that sounds warm, but that's actually quite cold in terms of water. So typically, just for an example, we want water to be closer to our body temperature. So like hot tubs are usually 98 to 100 to a little over 100 degrees. And then pools, we usually want them around 80 degrees for swimming comfortably. Anything below 70 is considered cold, and then 60 is considered life-threatening when exposed to an extended amount of time, and then anything below 60 is like hypothermia. Raymond's foster mother, Dolores Berry, she calls 911. She informs the operator that Raymond can't swim, and he tells them that he's trying to end his life. So firefighters show up, police show up, and then they just stand there on the beach. They don't go in the water. Why? Well, because of policy. So the Alameda Fire Department's certifications. Anyway, the certifications for land-based water rescue has lapsed due to budget cuts. And without that certification, you guys, I'm having a hard time with that word. Without it, entering the water would expose the city to liability. So the responders on the beach that day were following their department's rules, and they called for a Coast Guard boat instead. But the boat that got sent sat too deep in the water for that shallow shoreline. Remember, it's only up to his neck. And so they couldn't reach Raymond. And then on top of all this happening, so on top of the fire department and the police unable to get in the water and the Coast Guard unable to reach Raymond, there are roughly 75 people on the beach watching this all play out. Plus, there are people watching from their homes across the beach. So for almost an hour, Raymond stands there in that freezing water while, like I said, dozens of people are watching. And then one woman, she actually took off her shoes. She started going in, but the police told her not to. They told her to let the professionals handle it, aka the one standing around not handling it. Eventually, Raymond collapsed in the water, likely from hypothermia. And then, if what's already played out isn't bad enough, he starts floating face down for over 20 minutes. He slowly drifts back to the beach, and that's when finally a young woman in her 20s went in and pulled him to shore. So not the police, not the Coast Guard, not the fire department, like none of the first responders, just some random 20-something-year-old stranger. Raymond subsequently died at the local hospital. And afterward, a fire division chief was asked by a reporter point blank if he would have gone in to save a drowning child that day. And his answer was that on duty, he would have to stay within the policies and procedures. And that, my friends, is an example of policy over people. But I digress. The city was later sued by Raymond's family. The case, however, was dismissed because legally, the court found the responders had no duty to save him. Legally, nobody on that beach had to do anything according to policy and the court. So there's over 75 people, and Raymond still died. Now, later that year, on October 13th, 2011, there's another story with a similar theme. This took place on the other side of the world in Foshan, China. I think that's how you say that. It's a city in the Guangdong province. So again, you guys know I'm not good with pronunciations. So here there's a busy hardware market. There's narrow streets, shops open up right up to the road, and there's just people everywhere. And a 2-year-old girl named Wang Yue, I think that's how you say it, she wanders out of her family shop. Her dad is busy. He's tending the store. Her mom's busy. She's hanging laundry. And, just in the way that toddlers do, they wander around and she just slips out into the street. Now, horrifyingly, a van hits her. And the security camera footage shows the van actually slow down. And then they just keep driving, rolling its back wheel over her. This poor baby. So she's stuck there, lying in the street. She's crying, she's bleeding, and over the next 7 minutes, 18 people just walk on by or cycle on by her. 18 of them. Some look at her, some swerve to avoid her. One woman is walking with her own child and pulls her child away from the scene and just hurries off. And while Yue is lying there, a second van hits her. Devastating. And then the person who finally stopped was a 57-year-old woman named Chen Xianmei, a scrap collector. So she's one of the poorest people on the street, and she picked up Yue, moved her out of the road, and called for help until she found Yue's mother. Yue was rushed to the hospital, but her injuries were too severe, and she was declared brain dead, and sadly, horrifyingly died 8 days later. Now, the security footage went viral, and China basically had a national crisis of conscience over it. Millions of posts and people were asking, is it really so difficult to just be a good person? Like, who just lets a toddler lie in the middle of the street to get hit again? Well, this is where it gets a little bit complicated because in China at the time, there was this well known fear of helping strangers, which it sounds kind of wild, right? But that's because there had been publicized cases where Good Samaritans who helped injured people were later blamed and successfully sued by the very people they helped. And this was actually called the Peng Yu effect and was named after one of those cases. And actually, a newspaper poll around that time found that over 80% of respondents said that they would not help a senior citizen who fell in the street specifically because they were afraid of being blamed. There was even a passerby from UA's footage who told a local newspaper that if someone had been helping her at the time, they also would have stepped in to help. So basically, if someone else was helping, I would have helped. Crazy. Now we're going to take it back to 1964. This is actually one of the cases that I learned about during COVID that kind of just made me rethink or reevaluate how to interpret a situation, so to speak. Anyway, it's March 13th. It's 1964. We're in Queens, New York. It's around 3 a.m. A 28-year-old woman named Kitty Genovese is driving home from work. She managed a bar, so she often worked late nights, and by all accounts, she was funny, sharp, and she was very much adored by the regulars at the bar. She lived in Kew Gardens, which was, maybe still is, I'm not sure. At the time, at least, it was a safe neighborhood. She lived there in an apartment that she shared with her partner, Mary Ann. Now, because this was the 60s, at the time, they were referred to publicly as just roommates. I don't think that their true relationship was publicly part of the story until decades later. Anyway, a man named Winston Mosley had been driving around that night. Oh, and this pisses me off. Why? Why was he driving around that night? Because this sick fuck was specifically looking for a woman to attack. So he spots Kitty at a traffic light and he follows her home. After she parked her car and she walked toward her building, Winston came after her with a hunting knife. He attacked her right there on the street, right below her neighbor's windows. Kitty is screaming for help, and a neighbor, a man named Robert Moser, threw open his window and he yelled, "Let that girl alone." So Winston runs off. He leaves Kitty badly wounded. She manages to make her way toward the back of her building. She's out of view, and you think safe, right? The guy's gone. You're getting close to your home so you can call for help. And then 10 minutes later, she's still struggling. She's not inside. Winston comes back. He finds her in a stairwell vestibule where he then rapes her and then he stabs her again. Now, Sophia Farrar was a friend and a neighbor who had rushed downstairs like the moment that she understood something was wrong. She didn't even know whether or not the attacker was still there or not. And Sophia actually held Kitty until an ambulance arrived. However, sadly, Kitty died on the way to the hospital. So I mentioned Kitty was gay. Marianne was her partner. But like we've learned, it was the 60s, so that's, it's not really acceptable. So her partner, Marianne, was actually interrogated by police for roughly 6 hours after Kitty's attack. So she just lost her love. And now she's dealing with this. And they focused heavily on their romantic relationship. She is treated like a criminal, while the actual criminal is just out and about, all willy nilly, having fun, living life. And there's a documentary about Kitty called The Witness. And if I remember correctly, Marianne speaks off camera about Kitty and how her life was cut short right as she was entering an era where she might have been able to live more free and openly as her true self. And then, yeah, like I said, meanwhile, Marianne had to mourn her roommate, quote unquote, rather than her girlfriend because, the time and of the way that shit was. It's just an extra layer of sadness. So Winston, he's later caught a few days after he kills Kitty. It's during a burglary arrest, and he ends up confessing to Kitty's murder. He also confesses to killing 2 other women. Real stand-up guy. He stayed in prison until his death in 2016. Fuck that guy. All 3 stories, very horrific. They're all truly heartbreaking and sad. So, I mean, you're probably wondering, okay, yeah, death, sadness. What else do these 3 stories have in common with each other? And what do they have in common with the paddleboarding video? Well, they don't really have anything in common with the paddleboarding video. It's just kind of like parallel, maybe. Anyway, 2 weeks after Kitty was murdered, the New York Times ran a front page story with this headline. It said, 37 who saw murder didn't call the police, which is quite the headline. And then in the actual story, it claimed that 38, not 37, respectable, law-abiding citizens in that quiet neighborhood just sat by and watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks over half an hour, and not one of them called the police during the assault. So again, they're saying 38 witnesses. Nobody helped. The headline said 37. Story claims 38. We'll get to that. But for now, we have 3 stories happening in different places. We've got 2 different decades. We've got 3 different circumstances. But there's the same thread through all of them that, in my brain, ties into Natalie's paddleboarding video. So in Natalie's video, she was an active bystander. So she acted. In our 3 other stories with Kitty, Yue, and Raymond, people were there. They saw or they heard or they knew what was happening or what had already happened, and yet help didn't come until it was too late. And there's a name for this. It's called the bystander effect. And the reason we have a name for it at all really is because of Kitty Genovese and her murder. So back to the New York Times headline in that story, the 37/38 witnesses who quote unquote did nothing. Well, it wasn't true, at least not in the way that they told it. The number 38 actually came from a remark by the New York City Police Commissioner, and then the Times City editor, Abe Rosenthal, he just kind of ran with it. It was never really investigated or confirmed before publication, and in the decades since, researchers and journalists have gone back through the police records and the witness interviews, and because I like to make sure we have facts, here's what they've found that actually happened. So, most of the so-called witnesses heard something, but didn't actually see anything. Remember, it's 3 a.m., it's dark, and one of the attacks happened out of sight in that stairwell. And again, that story said there were 3 attacks, but there were 2. Now, obviously, this does not diminish what happened, and this doesn't diminish the bystander effect either, so just hold on for a second to that. So many neighbors, they had heard a scream or a commotion, but they didn't quite understand what was happening. They didn't understand it to be a violent attack. Some thought it was just, a lover's quarrel or just some drunks leaving the bar down the street. Also, it's 1964. There wasn't 911. So at the time, if you wanted to call police, you would have to dial 0, and then you'd have to hope an operator would pick up. And if an operator picked up, you would hope that they would transfer you to the right precinct, especially in a large city when there's multiple. So in a sense, to be fair, people did act. Robert, the neighbor, did yell out of his window. Remember, he's the one who interrupted the first attack. And reportedly, multiple people did call the police. And Sophia, Kitty's neighbor and friend, she's the one that ran down to Kitty after that final attack, and she held her as she was dying. So it's not totally fair to say that no one acted, but still. It all links together, okay? So in 2007, a study in American Psychologist went through the evidence and found, quote, no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses, or that witnesses observed the murder, or that those witnesses remained inactive. By the numbers, only about 2 people have ever been shown to have behaved the way the Times claimed 38 people behaved. And one of them was a neighbor. He reportedly cracked open his door, saw the attack happening, and close the door. Instead of calling the operator to call the police or do anything, he calls a friend and he asks his friend what he should do. And the friend just told him, hey, don't get involved. And those 6 words that he later said to investigators became infamous. And those 6 words were, I didn't want to get involved. So now in 2016, we're moving forward in time. We're kind of all over the place on timelines here, but in 2016, the Times itself finally admitted its original reporting was flawed and said their story grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived, and that nobody saw the attack in its entirety. However, the story had already defined urban apathy for half a century. So Kitty's story was in psychology textbooks. Maybe you even have a friend or you have a parent or you just know someone who told you this before, maybe before you moved to a big city. Like, hey, just so you know, I was scared to move to Portland after I heard this story because I heard about it during COVID and then we moved to Portland and that was a large city and I was kind of scared. Anyway, like I said, this does not negate the bystander effect, but it did paint this neighborhood and a lot of innocent people as monsters, which I don't think is fair. And this is kind of the part of true crime I was talking about that gives me like an icky feeling about it all, this complicated relationship. So I still hear people tell the story of the 38 witnesses. And, Sophia, the friend and neighbor who held her friend in her last moments, she spent the rest of her life attached to this story that was saying that nobody cared. And Kitty herself was honestly just kind of flattened into this like symbol, erasing her relationship from public stories for decades. And and The Witness, the documentary about Kitty, I think it wasn't made by her little brother Bill, but he was a producer. And I think he was kind of the driving force of the whole documentary. He was investigating what really happened the night of Kitty's murder. But anyway, regardless of whether the dramatized headline was real or dramatized, whatever, it freaked people out so badly that 2 social psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latane, they decided to test it. They asked if it were true that dozens of people failed to act, why would that happen? Like, is it because people are cold and heartless? Is there something else going on? And what they found is that, yes, the panic was built in essentially a myth, but there's some real science there. The bystander effect does, in fact, exist. It's been demonstrated over and over in labs for more than 50 years. The headline about Kitty's death was wrong, but it was weirdly correct about human nature. And while we're here, real quick, Kitty's story, it didn't just help push this discovery of the bystander effect or this wanting to look into it and be like, oh, well, why did so many people not react? But it also helped push the creation of the 911 emergency system. There was such an outrage over her case and over her murder that in 1968, on February 16th, the first 911 call in American history was made in Haleyville, Alabama. So, hopefully you never have to call 911, but if you do, or if you ever did, you're touching a part of Kitty's story. I don't really know if it's correct to call it a legacy. I'm honestly not sure how legacies come to be, but I'd say she left behind a legacy. Her murder led to the research and discovery of the bystander effect, and also we got 911 out of it. Again, it does not avenge her. She didn't get her life back. She essentially was unwillingly sacrificed for the greater good. It's complicated, right? Like, I don't think it's even right to call it bittersweet. It's just sad. But then there's also something good that came from it. But I wouldn't call that bittersweet. I don't know. Like I said, you guys, it's complicated. So let's just get into the bystander effect. Let's get into what John and Bib actually found. So in 1968, they published their famous experiment. And just a little side note now that I'm thinking about it, because this is an experiment on college students, it makes me want to maybe do an episode on the Stanford prison experiment. Maybe. We'll see. Anyway, college students were put in individual rooms and told that they would be discussing college life over an intercom, supposedly for privacy. And listen, it's the 60s. I don't know. I guess they thought that intercoms were private, whatever. Partway through, one of the voices on the intercom, which was actually secretly a recording, starts having what sounds like a severe seizure, and they're begging for help. Some participants believed it was just them and the victim on the call. Others believed that there was another person listening, and others believed there were four other people listening. So you have the setup, right? You, as the student, you believe you hear someone having a seizure. You're hearing them beg for help. So when participants thought that they were the only one who could hear this person having a seizure, the overwhelming majority went for help right away. When participants thought that four other people could also hear the seizures and the cries for help, the act of helping dropped dramatically. And on top of that, those who did respond took way longer to finally seek help. So in this study, the emergency didn't change. The only thing that changed was the belief that other people were also aware of the emergency. And then also that same year, they ran another study. I think it was called the smoke study. And in this study, participants were sat filling out questionnaires while smoke, which was actually steam, started pouring into the room through a vent. When people were alone, most of them got up and reported it within minutes. But when they were seated with two actors who had been instructed to just ignore the smoke and keep writing, only about 10% of participants ever said anything. People sat there fanning smoke away from their faces in a room that, for all they knew, was on fire because the people next to them seemed calm. And I don't know about you, but when I was reading about this, it made me question my own reactions to emergencies because sometimes I think that I become very calm in like an emergency situation, but I've been in situations that, they turned out fine, but it was a situation where I felt fear or danger, and I looked around and I saw that no one else was reacting. So I just decided that I must be overreacting and that I wasn't in danger. And luckily, I wasn't. Or if I was, I mean, it turned out fine and it was okay. But I don't know. Like now I'm going to really assess situations differently, even more. So yeah. So people sat in a room filling up with smoke because everyone around them acted like it was fine. So why is that? Why do we do that? Well, John and Bibb, along with the decades of research since, point to a few mechanisms. And some of these, they actually might sound familiar. So first up is the diffusion of responsibility. When you're the only one there, the responsibility falls 100% on you. When there are 20 people there, your brain does some math. And to be honest, I didn't know my brain could do math, but that's neither here nor there. When there are 20 people, your brain does this subconscious math and decides you hold only 5% of the responsibility. So you went from you being the only one, you have 100% falls on you. There's 20 people, only 5% falls on you. Someone else will call. Someone else is probably more qualified to handle this. Surely someone already did something. Those thoughts are, they're going through your mind, but guess what else? All 20 people sitting there with you are running the same math in their heads and they're having those same thoughts. So then the responsibility diffuses down to nobody. Think back to Raymond's case 75 people on the beach. They were probably thinking that, with this many people and actual firefighters and police and the Coast Guard just right there, it couldn't possibly be on them. Second, we have pluralistic ignorance. And this actually describes half of human behavior, which is just wild. We know that most emergencies, they start out pretty ambiguous, right? Is that a scream? Was that a fight? Is it a joke? Is that man in the water in trouble, or is he just standing there? And when we're not sure, we look around at the other people for cues. But everyone else is also not sure, and they're also looking around for cues while trying to remain calm. So when we all just see a crowd of calm faces, we subconsciously all come to the same conclusion. And the conclusion is, I guess everything's fine. A whole group of people basically talked themselves out of an emergency without even saying a single word out loud. So remember that one person from UA's case, the one who told a reporter that if someone else was helping, they would have done the same? They were waiting for permission from people who were also waiting for permission. And third, we have evaluation apprehension. Basically, this is just a fancy term for fear of embarrassment. And I think back to those very situations where I felt a sense of fear, a sense of danger, and I looked around and nobody else is doing anything. So I didn't want to be like the crazy person in the room, you know? And I think this is a lot more common than we probably realize. I'd like to say that I don't get embarrassed very easily. I don't get embarrassed in like the typical ways. Like it takes a lot for my friends or my parents to embarrass me. Usually I get embarrassed if I don't know, somebody it's hard to explain. I get embarrassed about silly things. I get embarrassed if I pull up to somebody who has the exact same car as me. I get embarrassed if I feel like I'm overreacting in a situation that no one else is really reacting to. I will get secondhand embarrassed if, somebody's like having an argument or like being a Karen. I think those are whatever. Anyway, what I'm saying is we subconsciously fear embarrassment in a lot of situations and we hate being wrong about a situation. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, what if I step in and I'm wrong? What if I grab a stranger's kid to prevent them from, going into the road and the parents yell at me? What if I call 911 over nothing and I'm just being dramatic? We're so scared of being cringe or being embarrassed that honestly, we could end up risking someone's life just to avoid it. And that might seem irrational, but there are versions that aren't irrational. So, again, with UA's case, they were living in a country where helping had literally gotten people sued. And, that woman in Raymond's case, she tried to get in the water, but she was told directly by police to stand down, let the professionals help. So sometimes the barrier isn't apathy necessarily or even at all. Sometimes it's a system that has taught people that stepping in is not their place, it's not their job, or sometimes even that it's not safe. And John and Bibb actually ended up mapping out 5 steps that all have to happen in order for a person to intervene. So, first, you have to notice the event. Then you have to interpret it as an emergency. Then you have to take personal responsibility for it. Then you have to believe that you know how to help. And then finally, you have to actually act. So if you fail any single step in this process, the whole chain collapses. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, yeah, obviously there's a difference between an emergency and minding your own business, but how am I supposed to know when to step in or not? Right? I mean, we're often raised not to be nosy. Don't insert yourself, stay in your lane, especially for women. It's so freaking complicated and double edged. We're taught both things at once. And it's not necessarily that we are taught these things by our parents or anything like that, or one person. It's kind of just like society. It kind of ingrains in us to be these things, not be nosy, don't insert yourself, stay in your lane. And then for women, society kind of ingrains in us to be endlessly helpful, but never make a scene. So it's not exactly very useful programming for emergencies, is it? So yeah, it's hard to know when to stay in your lane, when to mind your business, and then when to step in and assess a possible emergency. First thing we have to do to decide whether to mind our own business or not, it's to notice and interpret the problem. And like I've mentioned before, we are still very much connected to like our deep, deep ancient DNA, like back before we were like regular humans living out in the wild. And so that means that our body usually knows when something's off. And usually before our brain even comprehends it. You know what I mean? Like, you get that weird feeling. Sometimes people get physical feelings, like the hair on the back of their neck sticks up. Sometimes it's just like some you walk into a room, something feels off. Whatever. You walk to a situation, the vibes aren't vibing. You know what I mean? And that is data or DNA that is deeply ingrained in us, and we need to listen to it. So, something that stuck with me while doing this research was that you don't need certainty to check on someone. That was very powerful to me. I don't know. You don't need to be certain that it's an emergency or that there is danger just to check on someone. The cost of checking in on a person or a situation is honestly like 30 seconds of mild awkwardness. And if you got it wrong, you likely will never see these people ever again. You'll never have an interaction with them again. If it is someone you know, then oops, you say sorry, your heart was in the right spot, you move on. But then the cost of not checking in on a situation, like I'm not even being dramatic, but the cost of not checking in could be someone's life. So you kind of have to weigh it out. Do you want to deal with a little awkward half a minute of whatever? Or do you want to not deal with that awkward half a minute and then find out later while you're reading the paper, seeing something on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, that a situation that you walked by turned out to cost someone's life? A situation where if you would have just said like, "Hey, you all right?" I don't know. You have to weigh it out. Second, and this is regarding the whole responsibility problem, the whole not knowing if someone else is handling it or not, that whole situation. So in a crowd specifically, if you're ever the person who needs help, do not yell help to a crowd. Don't yell fire, don't yell rape. Basically, just don't yell into a crowd. It doesn't matter what you're yelling. If you're just yelling to a crowd, you're handing that responsibility over to everyone in the crowd, which means you're handing it to none. So instead, you want to point to a person. You in the red shirt, call 911. And this applies also to a situation if you need help, like delegating. So, like you've recognized that someone needs help. You've recognized the situation, you figured out there's an emergency, delegate. Because the research shows that assigning responsibility to a specific person, it collapses the diffusion instantly. The moment that one person breaks the spell of who's handling what, if anything, blah, 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 pluralistic ignorance, that whole thing of, oh, somebody else has it, probably, surely somebody else is taking care of this, that whole thing shatters if somebody is starting to hand out demands, like delegating what to do. And this kind of reminds everyone that they have permission to act, which sounds silly, but sometimes you need that. You just have to be that first domino, so to speak. So don't wait on someone else. And then back to the paddleboarding video, you'll notice something about Natalie's family, and that's that they nailed all of this without ever taking a training course. I mean, I guess I don't know. Maybe they did take a training course, but they noticed the yelling. They paddled toward it instead of away. They interpreted it correctly. They saw an ill-fitting life jacket, a kid saying he can't swim, he's been left alone. That's an emergency, even though a group of laughing teenagers were, acting and saying that it wasn't. They then took responsibility. So they weren't scanning the riverbank for someone more official. They knew how to help. They extended the paddle, they kept him calm, they stayed stable, and they acted. And that's what an active bystander looks like. So, not a superhero with a cape, not some official professional, whatever. Simply a family on paddleboards who decided that the yelling, the situation, it was their business and they stepped in. And while digging around this topic, I found some newer research that complicates. I don't know if complicates is the right word here, but we're going to go with it. It complicates the bleak version of the bystander story, but in a good way. Who knew complications could be good, right? So, a study that analyzed real surveillance footage of public conflicts in multiple countries found that in roughly 9 out of 10 incidents, at least one bystander intervened, and more bystanders around actually made it more likely that someone helped. So the lesson of all of this was never that people are these heartless, cold, selfish people. The lesson is that helping, it has failure points. They're very specific, very predictable, and they're very fixable failure points. And once you can see them, you can beat them, you can fix them. The whole effect runs on nobody wanting to go first. So you just have to go first. Forget the possible embarrassment. You just have to go first. Now, being a bystander is obviously very nuanced, though, right? Most of the time, I myself am a firm believer in minding your own business. Blame it on being tangled up in enough drama as a teenager in my early 20s, learning to mind my own business the hard way. But most of the time, whatever is happening over there, frankly, isn't my concern. And I think in general, this sounds hypocritical, but in general, I think the world could use a little bit more minding their own business. And I mean that in the sense of like, I'm not saying that we should intervene just because two people aren't at total peace with each other. You know what I'm saying? And after living in Portland, not everyone sleeping on a stoop or a park bench needs to be checked on. You kind of have to know and learn how to read a situation and understand if something is genuinely not safe or is safe, if that makes sense. I don't really know, guys. It's getting late. All that to say, sometimes as fellow humans, even though I think that most of the time we should mind our own business, we do have a responsibility, whether we like it or not, to step in when a situation arises. I think to be like a respectable, good person in this society, we need to take on that responsibility of learning how to read a situation and stepping in when someone needs help. Because we are all in this together. We can't just always blindly rely on a system to step in for us, especially as women. And that leads me to two, I'll try to make them quick, two personal stories that I wanted to share. Um, they were kind of the catapult for me to not fully trust or rely blindly on a system to help me. So, my first realization that a system is flawed and that a system won't always help was when I was in, I think, the fourth grade. Uh, my cousin, she was out with her boyfriend. They ran into her ex boyfriend and, a dispute broke out. Cops were called. They were in a public setting. Cops came. She and her boyfriend were sent on their way. And then her ex, who had clearly been drinking, um, wasn't held. The cops let him drive off anyway. Like he didn't even go to the drunk take. And he knew where she lived. He knew where they were going. So he caught up to them. He ran them off the road and she was pinned. The car had flipped and the car was on fire and she was pinned. And I had never seen a full body cast before. I didn't even know they were real until her funeral because her boyfriend was in one. And actually, maybe it wasn't like a full on cast, but he was bandaged like head to toe from what I remember. And yeah, I don't know, the system that should have held her ex in the drunk tank at least, or just held him there for like an extra, I don't know, like half hour or something. I don't know. They didn't. And that system failed. And it resulted in her death. So that was my first experience of understanding not to rely on the system. I'm not blaming the cops for her death. That was her ex. But the system failed. And then the second thing that happened was to me personally. I was in high school. I think I was 16 or 17 years old. I was working at the local gas station with some of my friends. If you don't know me, I grew up in a very small Midwest town. I think the sign says like 1,800-ish people, but honestly, it feels like only 500 people live there. Anyway, so I'm working at one of the gas stations and a man, a regular customer, someone, who's known, he's respected in town, his whole family's well respected in town. He approaches me and my friend that I'm working with, and we liked him. He came in often. Like I said, he was a regular. He was older than us. I mean, we're in high school. He's older than us, but he's not like uncool old, but he's not really cool old either. Like he's not a freshman in college. He just kind of gave that safe, older vibe that you get from some young adults when you're a teenager, like almost like they're a cool young uncle or something. Anyway, so I mean, this is going to sound like there's so many red flags, but remember, we are teenagers. It's a small town. Everyone knows everyone. It was also a very different time, blah, 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 blah. So this guy who's been doing, I think he was doing personal training sessions with some of the athletes from school. He tells us that he bought a tanning bed. Again, Midwest small town. It's common for people to own a tanning bed. A lot of people will put it in their garage or their shed or a separate part of their home with its own entrance. And then they just kind of let people use it. Like for a fee, you usually pay, but it was usually cheaper than the salon. And there are a lot of tanaholics. I don't know if that's every small town or if that's a small Midwestern town or if that was just our town, but there's a limit to how often you can go to tanning salons and use the tanning beds. And so these places are like probably unregistered. I don't really know how it works, but that means these tanaholics get to go and visit multiple tanning beds in one day, and then they can get real tan and leathery. So it's not an uncommon thing. I know it sounds like red flag, but for a small Midwest town at the time, it was not. So he hands us his card. He says that along with personal training, he wants to offer the tanning bed just to make some extra money. He tells us that we can use it for free as long as we basically recruit others to tan. Now, this is where hindsight's 2020. He's asking teenage girls to essentially recruit teenage girls because obviously that's who we are friends with and that's who we spend our time with. But we're pumped. We are so stoked. We feel like we're part of his business. And on top of that, my mom, rightfully so, wouldn't let me tan. And you needed a parent's permission to tan back then. I don't remember how old you had to be to tan without your parents' permission, but I was still at the age where I needed my parents' permission. I'm not sure how it works now, but whatever. And also, like, she wasn't going to let me because of skin cancer. It's kind of not really a great thing. So, good on my mom for saying no. But there I was, a teenager, and I'm being offered free access to a tanning bed that I don't need my mom's permission for. And prom is right around the corner. So, obviously, I'm freaking stoked. Plus, his house was right by the school, by the high school. So, perfect. We don't have to drive out to the country to some old lady's house. We have this guy right here. We know him. We like him. Other people know him. Other people trust him. So we start going and we start going quite frequently. I think that we would go like multiple times a week. I would go like, I don't know. I think honestly I went under 5 minutes at a time because I don't exactly tan. I just burn and then I freckle, but I always went with a friend or two, mostly because of Final Destination. I was not trying to end up like a hot dog. Okay. I didn't want to get stuck in a tanning bed and explode. So other than that, like there's nothing weird. No alarm bells are going off yet. It's in his basement, which again, it sounds crazy, but it's not. And it has its own entrance. It's where he does like the personal training gym stuff. So all the gym equipment's down there. A couple of times we saw some people doing some training. And then one day, as we're headed to the tanning room, we notice a closet door. And we didn't really notice it before because it was always closed. But this time it's kind of like left open. And I don't know. I guess like up until then, we just figured that it was storage or maybe even a bathroom that was just locked. And I don't even know if we ever tried to open the door. I think we just like were so focused on the tanning room. But now it's open. So we peek inside, and on the floor, we see a bunch of blankets and pillows, and it just honestly kind of looked like someone was sleeping in there. And so, mind you, when you tan, you typically tan in your underwear or swimsuit or nude. So, with that closet door being there and seeing what was inside of it and realizing that it shares a wall with the tanning room, I just finally got weird feelings. I got like the alarm bell started going off in my head of something's not quite right. I was getting the heebie jeebies. I still, at the time, didn't think that anything like crazy was going on. I just kind of thought that it was weird that maybe somebody slept in there. And I think we brought it up more of like, hey, someone might be using your basement as a bedroom. Not sure if you knew, thought you'd want to know for safety, blah, blah, blah. But my body knew something was wrong. My brain just hadn't deciphered it yet, you know? So I stopped going after that. And it was around this time that a lot of girls were going there to tan. And I don't remember exactly how young. I feel like some of the girls were honestly like 15 or 14 years old. I really can't remember. It's it was a long time ago, but regardless, we're all girls, okay? We're all teenagers, we're children. Now, fast forward, I'm like 19 or 20, I think at this point. I start getting calls from our town's police department. And I ignore the calls because at the time I was dating this absolute loser. And I thought that it had something to do with him because he had been kind of in trouble with some cops. And I just wasn't having it. Like, I'm not dealing with your shit. But then a friend of mine, a friend who actually lived in that house where the tanning bed was, she reached out and she asked if I was getting calls from the cops. And I'm like, yeah, how did you know? And she just tells me that I should call the cops back, to which I say, no, not until I know why. So then she tells me that she's not supposed to tell me, but I told her, like, I'm not calling them until I know why. So tell me why, otherwise, this is pointless. And then that's when she tells me that the guy's girlfriend or wife, she had taken her camera to her nephew's soccer game or something like that. And she was wanting to record it. And so she goes to check the storage or clean it or whatever. And that's when she sees footage of girls in the tanning room. So my friend tells me that she was asked if she could identify anyone in the videos, and she said that she could only identify me in what she saw. So that's why the cops were calling me. And then she told me, like, don't tell anyone yet. So I immediately call the cops back. I leave a couple of voicemails, but ultimately I never hear back. I just kind of assumed that like the system would bring justice, you know, and figure it out and that they would call me back. So cut to, I think like the next year, a friend of mine, well, and I didn't shut up. After the cops didn't call me back like a month later, I just started telling everybody, like anyone I knew who had used that tanning bed, I was like, hey, you need to know what's going on. And so one of my friends who had used the tanning bed, she sends me this news article and it's of that man. It's an article of him being accused of illegally recording young women. Young women. I'm sick to my stomach. We were not women. We were not young women. We were literal children. Then we find out later that he doesn't even get charged with anything or he wasn't found guilty or whatever. As far as I know, nothing ever came of it because nobody ever told us anything. And actually, just to add to the disgustingness of this human being, a few years back, probably like 5 years ago, he adds me on Facebook. And so, me being snarky, whatever, I send him like a request for money, like $1,000 or something. I don't know. And he's like, LOL, what's this for? And I'm like, do you seriously not remember who I am? And then he said something like, they didn't find me guilty or some shit like that. And then I think he threw in another LOL for good measure, like basically bragging that he got away with it. I can't remember the exact words. I blocked him. I deleted the message. I was utterly disgusted. So That's an example of how the system failed us. I never got a call back. I never got to identify myself or help the other girls be identified. We don't know how many tapes there were. We don't know if they were all found, if they were destroyed. We don't know if they were uploaded online. And so, we don't know if there are photos or videos of us on the internet somewhere for sick perverts to watch. So, yeah, I know those aren't necessarily bystander effect related, but those are just two stories that show that you can't always rely on the system to step in and help you. The system fails us all the time. And it's not because the system is necessarily nefarious, that the people in the system are nefarious. Sometimes systems fail because they're underfunded, they're understaffed. Sometimes they are biased. Sometimes it's just because they're made of ordinary people who get distracted by something else while your emergency is happening. Sometimes the system does work and sometimes justice is served. But honestly, sometimes the only functioning safety mechanism in the room is a person who decides something is their business. And in my story, there was an active bystander. The girlfriend or wife or ex, I don't remember what she was at this point when she found the videos. She could have deleted that footage and moved on. She loved him, or at least used to love him, and so she could have protected him. She could have pretended she never saw it. She could have, minded her business, didn't want to get involved, but she acted and she reported it. She tried to help us. She indirectly made me aware of something that happened to me and ultimately made me a much more conscious person. Like, she reminded me to listen to my gut and reevaluate situations, like think them through all the way. Granted, I was a teenager at the time. My frontal lobe wasn't developed, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, I went on a tangent there. So, the American Psychological Association encourages people to become active bystanders by interrupting harmful behavior before it escalates. And the framework experts recommend is called the 5 Ds. And the 5 Ds are distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct. First, distract if you can. You want to interrupt the situation indirectly. So you want to drop something or ask for directions. Just be casually annoying. So you're not confronting anyone. You're just kind of breaking the momentum and pulling attention away from the person being targeted. And then to delegate means you find someone better positioned to help. So a manager, a bus driver, security, or 911 if the situation calls for it. Getting help counts as helping. It always has. If no one is better, you delegate yourself. And that doesn't mean that you silently delegate. Remember, you need to point to the person and tell them what to do. You, 911, you get me water and you give me your jacket. Or, hey, I'm calling 911. And then you could, you're delegating yourself there. And then you want to document. So if someone else is already helping, safely record what's happening from a distance. I know that can seem annoying, but accountability does matter. And a lot of times accountability only counts when it's caught on camera. And then you want to give that footage to the person who was harmed so that they can decide what happens with that footage. It's their story. It's not your content. It's not for TikTok. You know what I'm saying? And if you can't give it directly to that person, if police show up or an ambulance, find someone to talk to, either there or at the police station or hospital. Let them know what you have and ask them who you can leave it with for the correct person to get. The other D, the fourth D, is to delay. Now, this isn't to delay the response. This is more so even if you couldn't act in the moment, this is to check on the person afterwards. So it's kind of, you don't want to purposely delay the response. This is the delayed response. So, you ask them, are you okay? Do you want me to stay with you? Do you want help with reporting this? Sometimes the intervention is just kind of making sure that someone isn't alone with what just happened to them. And then finally, direct. So you want to confront the behavior head on, but only if it's safe for you and for them. Okay. Like, don't intervene in a situation that is going to get you killed. this is if you can safely confront a behavior head on. So you want to keep it brief, keep your focus on the person being harmed, and don't get pulled into any kind of like debate or argument. You're not there to win an argument. And sometimes it's simply asking someone if they're okay and being direct with them. And with this, honestly, don't let someone speak for them. You can say, I don't like how you're grabbing her arm, so I'm asking her if she's okay. Something like that. So you're addressing the behavior, you're not addressing the character. You're not calling someone a creep or accusing them of anything. You're just stating an action that you can see. And 4 out of 5 of those don't even require you to confront anyone. So you don't have to be brave, even like you don't have to be this superhero. It doesn't have to be this big grand gesture. You just have to be that first domino, remember? And that's a bit about the bystander effect. Again, you guys, I'm really taking you on my little brain journeys, so this might have been all over the place. So, just to recap here, a video of a family paddleboarding led me to an ongoing case of a boy who drowned and whether it was an accident or not. And that led me back to the paddleboarding video, which led me to the bystander effect and cases with that in common, which led me to some very interesting studies, which led me to learning about how to be an active bystander and when to be one, which led me to my own vulnerable stories to show that you can't always rely on a system to step in. And now we are here. I don't know if that's A to Z, but I mean, we got from A to Z just so we can go in order. So now we're sitting here, and hopefully, you, the listener, and we know how to be better active bystanders. And we also know when to mind our own business. And also, we know that stepping in, it isn't the worst. And then we also know that minding your business is usually okay. I know it's a little confusing, but I think it really is kind of one of those moments that once you learn about these cases or you learn about the bystander effect or the studies and you have these tucked in the back of your mind, it's going to be one of those moments where when you know, you know, you just have to listen to your gut, listen to your instincts, and you just have to be the first person to step in. And if you have any stories about being an active bystander or other stories where bystanders didn't act, please feel free to DM me. Also, DM me if you have any suggestions for upcoming episodes. You can find me on Instagram at indistinct.pod or at Eliza Hollister. And if you enjoyed today's episode, whatever platform you're listening on, please rate, review, share, whatever it lets you do. I appreciate it more than you know. And I'm going to leave you with this. Would you step in or would you assume someone else already is in charge of the situation? I want you to think about that and we will chat next week. Love ya. Love you.